Ivy Montgomery had just celebrated her 30th birthday, yet she carried a profound heaviness within her chest that made her feel as though she had lived through several grueling lifetimes. Nestled within the breathtaking rolling landscapes of the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, a region famously known for its sweeping mountain vistas and sprawling elite agricultural estates, she lived a life completely hidden from the affluent grandeur. Her entire world revolved around her beloved mother, Catherine, a remarkably resilient woman whose hands were permanently rough from scrubbing floors for wealthy neighbors and baking fresh apple pies to keep their meager household afloat. The two women shared a tiny, drafty wooden cabin situated at the very edge of the dense forest, its wooden beams heavily warped by decades of harsh Virginia winters. But to Ivy, the familiar scent of burning pine and warm cinnamon within those walls meant everything. She woke long before dawn every single morning, chopping heavy firewood and taking on any available odd jobs in the bustling town square, desperately shielding her aging mother from the biting cold of their harsh financial reality. The peaceful rhythm of their quiet life shattered completely. The seasoned Catherine developed a persistent dry cough that initially seemed like a simple passing winter ailment. Days turned into agonizing weeks, and Catherine's legendary boundless energy slowly evaporated into the freezing air, leaving her permanently confined to her quilt-covered bed, while a mysterious aggressive illness ravaged her increasingly frail body. The local medical clinic demanded steep financial payments they could not possibly afford, forcing Ivy to sacrifice her steady, reliable shifts at the general store to become a full-time, dedicated caregiver. She spent countless sleepless nights sitting rigidly by the bedside, listening to the agonizing rattle in her mother's chest, desperately praying to whatever forces existed in the vast valley sky for a miracle that stubbornly refused to manifest. Ivy constantly tried to paint vivid, hopeful pictures of the future for her mother, speaking softly of spring blooms and the little community bakery they would one day open together, hoping the gentle dreams would serve as a vital lifeline. Reality, however, possessed absolutely no mercy for their gentle, fragile dreams, and on a frost-covered Tuesday morning, Catherine quietly slipped away in her sleep. She took the comforting warmth of the little cabin entirely with her, leaving Ivy permanently anchored to an unbearable, deafening silence that echoed through every single room. The days immediately following the modest, quiet funeral blurred into a chaotic, surreal haze of well-meaning neighbors dropping off warm casseroles and offering hollow condolences that barely penetrated Ivy's immense grief. The physical absence of her mother echoed through the narrow, dusty hallways. Catherine's knitting basket remained untouched on the wooden rocking chair, and the delicate scent of her favorite lavender soap still lingered heavily in the washroom. Ivy wandered through the empty rooms like a lost spirit, desperately waiting to hear her name called out from the tiny kitchen, but the suffocating silence only deepened with each passing hour. While she drowned in an ocean of sorrow, an entirely different kind of destructive storm began gathering at her doorstep, in the sinister form of estranged relatives who had completely ignored Catherine for years. Her Uncle Richard, a man who typically only appeared when he needed a desperate financial favor, suddenly began visiting the secluded cabin with unnerving frequency and a thick leather briefcase full of legal documents. He wore a carefully crafted mask of deep familial concern, speaking in rapid, highly confusing terms about overdue property taxes, unpaid municipal fees, and the urgent absolute need to update the cabin's ancient deed to protect Ivy from government seizure. Her mind heavily clouded by profound grief, Ivy saw only an uncle supposedly trying to shield his mourning niece from a terrifying bureaucratic nightmare she simply did not understand. Trusting the familiar blood that tied them together, she picked up a heavy pen and signed the thick stack of complicated papers without ever reading the microscopic fine print. That single trusting stroke of ink rapidly became the most devastating, catastrophic mistake of her entire life, altering her destiny in ways she could never have anticipated. 6 agonizing months later, a man dressed in a sharply tailored suit knocked aggressively on her front door, accompanied by the local county sheriff to coldly inform her that he was the brand-new legal owner of the property. Ivy stared at the stamped eviction notice in absolute paralyzing disbelief, pleading desperately that there must be some terrible mistake, crying that she had lived within those log walls since she was a newborn baby. The official, legally binding documents told a cold, entirely undeniable story. The beloved cabin had been legally sold, the property deed permanently transferred, and the ruthless buyer possessed every legal right to force her out into the cold. Panic rising sharply in her throat, Ivy drove her rusted truck to Richard's house, called his phone countless times, and searched every local diner, only to find that her uncle and the rest of the estranged family had completely vanished with the profits. They had viciously preyed upon her absolute lowest moment, weaponizing her deep grief and innocent ignorance of complex property law to steal the only sanctuary she had left in the world. Having absolutely zero financial savings to hire a competent attorney, and lacking the emotional fortitude to fight a drawn-out, highly expensive legal battle, Ivy was violently forced to accept the bitter, crushing defeat. On her final tear-filled morning in the beloved cabin, she meticulously packed her entire life into 2 worn leather suitcases, taking only her simple clothes and a small, precious stack of Catherine's faded photographs. She paused heavily at the threshold, her trembling fingers lingering on the wooden door frame where her mother used to proudly mark her height as a child, feeling the profound loss carve a second hollow space into her chest. With the biting Virginia wind whipping her face, she walked away from her childhood home forever. Entirely unsure of where she would sleep that night, Ivy ended up sitting quietly in a secluded corner booth at a bustling, neon-lit roadside diner on the outskirts of the town, nursing a single cup of black coffee she had managed to pay for with her few remaining coins. A kind-hearted, perceptive diner owner named Martha noticed the heavy tear tracks cutting through the dust on Ivy's pale cheeks, and sat down across from her, offering a warm slice of cherry pie and a highly sympathetic listening ear. After hearing the tragic, infuriating story of the stolen cabin and the family betrayal, Martha mentioned an older, eccentric gentleman named Arthur, who ran a modest goat farm out in the rugged, rocky foothills. Martha softly explained that Arthur could not offer much of a monetary salary, but he was in desperate need of a reliable farmhand and promised a dry room and 3 square meals a day for anyone willing to endure the grueling labor. Facing the terrifying looming prospect of freezing on the unforgiving streets, Ivy thanked the kind woman, picked up her heavy suitcases, and began the long, exhausting trek toward the foothills. The unpaved dirt road leading to Arthur's secluded property seemed to stretch on forever, winding endlessly through dense pine forests and rocky terrain until it finally opened up to a humble, weathered agricultural farm. There were no grand wrought-iron gates or expensive thoroughbred horses like the neighboring wealthy estates possessed. Instead, there were sturdy, rustic wooden fences, a couple of aging barns, and dozens of vocal goats roaming the vast pastures. An older man with silver hair and a deeply lined face sat peacefully on the front porch, his steady, observant gaze evaluating Ivy as she approached, completely out of breath, but radiating a quiet, undeniable determination. She introduced herself softly, laying her desperate, heartbreaking situation completely bare, speaking honestly of her mother, her uncle's unforgivable betrayal, and her absolute willingness to work herself to the bone in exchange for basic shelter. Arthur listened closely, without ever interrupting his weathered expression unreadable, until he finally nodded toward a small outbuilding and told her that her very first shift started precisely at dawn. The tiny room attached to the main barn held absolutely nothing but a narrow iron cot and a single window overlooking the sprawling pastures. Yet to Ivy, it felt like a royal, highly protected sanctuary. Her days began long before the sun crested the majestic Blue Ridge Mountains, involving hauling heavy bags of feed, repairing broken fence lines, and learning the stubborn, complex personalities of the goat herd, alongside an elderly, grumpy but kind farmhand named Samuel. The daily work was physically punishing, leaving her hands severely blistered and her muscles constantly aching, but the steady, demanding routine provided a necessary welcome distraction from the heavy grief that still haunted her quiet moments. Arthur proved to be a man of very few words, yet he showed his deep appreciation by leaving an extra thick blanket on her bed during a sudden cold snap, and patiently teaching her the intricate details of animal husbandry. Slowly, the modest farm transformed from a desperate temporary refuge into a highly comforting place where Ivy could finally breathe again without feeling the crushing weight of her recent losses. One crisp, clear afternoon, while she was actively mending a heavy wooden gate near the main entrance, the loud roar of a heavy-duty truck engine abruptly broke the usual peaceful tranquility of the isolated farm. A tall, strikingly handsome man stepped out, dressed in practical denim and a flannel shirt, but carrying an unmistakable air of quiet confidence that hinted he did not truly belong to the working class. He greeted Arthur with a highly familiar, firm handshake, chatting easily about the changing seasons and the local livestock market, while Ivy continued her work, trying desperately to remain entirely invisible in the background. Arthur eventually waved her over, introducing the unexpected visitor as Edward Abbott, a deeply famous name that made Ivy's breath instantly catch in her throat. The Abbott family practically owned half the Shenandoah Valley. They were a massive dynasty of agricultural barons whose immense wealth and political influence completely dictated the local economy and social hierarchy. Expecting the typical, deeply ingrained arrogance characteristic of the valley's elite circles, Ivy was entirely disarmed when Edward offered a genuinely warm, highly respectful smile and a firm, polite handshake. He did not look at her heavily calloused hands or mud-stained boots with any trace of disdain. Instead, he asked highly insightful, intelligent questions about her daily work with the goats, showing a deep appreciation for the grueling nature of farm life. After that surprising initial meeting, Edward's truck began appearing at Arthur's farm with surprising, increasing regularity, always under the thin guise of checking on local agricultural trends or discussing feed prices with the old man. However, it quickly became highly apparent to everyone that Edward was actively finding every possible excuse to wander near the goat enclosures, leaning casually against the wooden rails to strike up long conversations with the quiet woman working there. The daily discussions started out incredibly simple, revolving entirely around the unpredictable Virginia weather and the stubbornness of the animals, but they gradually evolved into much deeper, highly personal exchanges of their respective histories. Edward confessed honestly that carrying the heavy Abbott name often felt like wearing a suffocating iron collar. He was constantly burdened by the massive expectations of his powerful father, Aaron, who demanded ruthless business tactics over basic human decency. In return, Ivy bravely shared the tender, beautiful memories of baking with her beloved mother and the searing, profound pain of being cast out of her childhood home by the very people who were supposed to protect her. She found that Edward listened with a rare, undivided attention, his eyes reflecting a deep, genuine empathy that made her feel truly seen and entirely understood for the first time since her mother passed away. The slowly shifting seasons brought a steadily deepening bond between the humble goat farmer and the wealthy agricultural heir, forged not in lavish, expensive restaurants, but in the quiet, dusty corners of the rural landscape. One particularly turbulent, highly humid afternoon, a sudden violent thunderstorm rolled heavily over the valley, forcing Ivy and Edward to sprint desperately for cover inside a hay-filled, dimly lit storage barn. With the torrential rain hammering relentlessly against the tin roof and the sweet scent of dry grass filling the humid air, the invisible barrier between their vastly different worlds completely dissolved into nothingness. Sitting shoulder to shoulder on a rough bale of hay, Edward admitted that, despite the millions tied to his family name, he deeply envied the simple, honest purpose he saw in Ivy's daily life. Ivy, tracing the grain of the wooden floorboards, softly confessed her lingering, terrifying fear of ever hoping for a better future, terrified that the rug would be violently pulled out from under her once again. When the massive storm finally broke, leaving behind a freshly washed sky painted in brilliant shades of bruised purple and bright gold, the silence between them was highly charged with unspoken, powerful realizations. In the weeks that followed that afternoon, the small town began to actively notice Edward's incredibly frequent trips toward the foothills, and the tight-knit, highly gossipy community of the valley wasted absolutely no time spinning wild tales. The malicious whispers inevitably reached the highly attentive ears of Valerie Price, the deeply privileged daughter of a wealthy real estate developer who had long considered herself Edward's guaranteed future bride. Valerie and Edward had attended the exact same exclusive galas and charity balls since childhood, and she viewed the prospect of their eventual marriage as a completely foregone conclusion, a highly strategic alliance between two powerful families. Hearing that her supposed destined husband was spending his afternoons with a penniless farmhand ignited a cold, calculating, and deeply destructive fury within her. Valerie possessed a highly cunning, manipulative mind, and knew perfectly well that throwing a public tantrum would only push Edward further away, so she opted for a much more insidious, deeply psychological approach. She began hosting elegant, exclusive dinner parties, casually dropping poisonous, highly calculated remarks about manipulative fortune hunters who deliberately used tragic sob stories to ensnare wealthy, highly sympathetic men. Without ever saying Ivy's name directly, Valerie expertly planted toxic seeds of doubt among the town's elite, painting a highly fabricated picture of a deceitful woman who had meticulously planned her arrival. The toxic venom spread through the valley like an uncontrollable wildfire, mutating into outrageous, entirely false claims that Ivy had faked her mother's debts, or possessed a highly hidden criminal record in a neighboring state. The malicious, heavily fabricated rumors eventually reached the imposing mahogany desk of Aaron Abbott, a stern man whose entire identity was built exclusively upon the flawless, highly respected reputation of his family's empire. Aaron immediately summoned his son to the grand main study of their sprawling estate, his face a tight mask of barely contained rage as he aggressively confronted Edward about the scandalous gossip tarnishing their spotless name. Edward fiercely, passionately defended Ivy, praising her unmatched resilience and profound honesty, boldly declaring his deep feelings for her, and entirely refusing to end the relationship simply to appease the snobbish, judgmental country club crowd. The heated argument violently shattered the fragile, uneasy peace of the Abbott household, drawing a hard, unforgiving line in the sand between a father obsessed with generational legacy and a son fighting desperately for his own heart. Ivy rapidly began to feel the incredibly heavy weight of the town's sudden, unexplainable hostility. Cashiers at the local supply store glared at her openly, and conversations abruptly stopped whenever she walked into a room. Edward desperately tried to shield her from the venom visiting the secluded farm even more frequently, to visibly prove his unwavering loyalty, but the sheer exhaustion of fighting a war on multiple fronts began to show in his tense posture. One evening, while sitting quietly on the wooden porch with Arthur and Samuel, Ivy watched Edward's truck pull away into the dusk, a tight knot of profound dread tightening painfully in her stomach. She told the old farmer that she deeply feared her mere presence was destroying the Abbott family, but Arthur merely shook his head, stating firmly that a love truly worth having always required standing firm against a gale. Valerie, however, quickly noticed that her sophisticated whisper campaign had completely failed to separate the couple. If anything, Edward's stubborn defiance had only made him significantly more devoted to the farmhand. Realizing that poisonous words alone would not achieve her ultimate goal, the ruthless socialite decided to aggressively target the very physical ground beneath Ivy's feet, hitting her where she was most vulnerable. She secretly hired a team of expensive private investigators to dig deeply into Arthur's finances, discovering that the old man had been quietly drowning in massive debt for years, keeping his profound struggles hidden behind a stoic facade. Armed heavily with this destructive knowledge, Valerie leveraged her father's massive real estate company to aggressively buy up Arthur's outstanding high-interest loans, placing her in a position of absolute terrifying power over the goat farm. The devastating, catastrophic blow arrived on a bleak, freezing Wednesday morning when two men dressed in sharp, expensive suits parked their sleek luxury sedan directly in front of Arthur's wooden porch. They coldly presented the old man with a thick stack of legal documents demanding immediate full repayment of the newly consolidated debts, a financial sum so massive that Arthur could never possibly hope to pay it. If he refused or failed to produce the funds, the entire property would be legally seized and quickly auctioned off by the bank, leaving him with absolutely nothing to show for a lifetime of hard, honest work. Beaten down by the relentless, terrifying pressure, Arthur painfully signed the property deed over to an anonymous corporate holding company, completely unaware that Valerie was the hidden architect of his total ruin. When he broke the devastating news to Ivy and Samuel, his voice trembled heavily with deep shame, apologizing profusely for failing to protect the safe sanctuary they had painstakingly built together. The true, horrifying cruelty of the situation was fully revealed 3 days later when Valerie herself arrived at the farm, stepping gracefully out of her vehicle, wearing pristine leather riding boots and a highly victorious, wicked smirk. She confidently called Ivy into the main barn, her tone dripping with false, sickening sympathy, as she explained that the new management direction, unfortunately, did not include retaining the current outdated staff. Valerie gave Ivy exactly 24 hours to pack her meager belongings and permanently vacate the premises, aggressively ensuring that Edward's beloved farmhand would be entirely removed from the valley once and for all. The ground completely vanished beneath Ivy's feet. For the second time in a few short years, she was being violently thrown out into the bitter cold, stripped of her home and her livelihood by people wielding their power like a weapon. Edward drove frantically to the farm the exact moment he heard the terrible news, his face completely pale with shock and deep fury as he found Ivy strapping her 2 worn suitcases into the back of Arthur's rusted spare truck. He practically begged her to let him help, passionately offering to rent her a secure apartment in town or physically confront Valerie and his father. But Ivy gently, firmly pulled her calloused hands away from his desperate grasp. She explained softly that she loved him far too much to let him completely destroy his own life for her, and that she absolutely refused to become the helpless, dependent victim the town falsely accused her of being. Heavy tears pooled in Edward's eyes as he promised repeatedly that he would find a way to fix the incredible mess. But Ivy simply kissed his cheek, climbed into the truck, and drove out of the valley, leaving her heart behind. She relocated to a neighboring, heavily industrial county, eventually finding grueling work at a sprawling commercial apple orchard, managed by a gruff but entirely fair foreman named Thomas. Her new living quarters consisted of a highly cramped, uninsulated metal trailer at the very edge of the apple groves, and her long days were spent climbing tall wooden ladders and hauling heavy bushels until her shoulders screamed in agony. The incredibly demanding physical labor was a strange blessing in disguise, leaving her far too exhausted to dwell on the agonizing, beautiful memories of Edward's smile or the comforting, familiar sounds of Arthur's goat herd. Yet, despite her very best determined efforts to move on, Edward stubbornly called Thomas's office phone every single week, entirely refusing to let the connection sever his voice, serving as a deeply painful reminder of everything she had lost. Back in the Shenandoah Valley, Valerie's supposed ultimate victory felt incredibly hollow. Aggressively removing Ivy from the map had absolutely not driven Edward into her eagerly waiting arms as she had planned. Instead, he withdrew completely from the elite social circle, burying himself deeply in the administrative work of the ranch, and treating Valerie with an icy, silent contempt that made her blood boil with frustration. Aaron commended his son's renewed, intense focus on the family business, mistakenly believing that the foolish infatuation with the farmhand had finally run its natural course and completely faded away. But beneath the calm surface, Edward was quietly gathering his own powerful resources, secretly hiring independent researchers to look into the aggressive buyout of Arthur's farm and the sudden highly suspicious expansion of his father's land holdings. Ivy's fragile, newly established routine violently shattered the cold night. Thomas knocked loudly on her trailer door, holding out the receiver of the office phone with a highly grim, serious expression. It was the main hospital back in the valley. Arthur had suddenly collapsed from a severe heart attack, his physical health rapidly deteriorating after losing the beloved farm that had been his entire world. Dropping absolutely everything, Ivy borrowed Thomas's truck and drove recklessly through the pitch-black night, praying desperately the entire way that she would not be too late to say goodbye. When she rushed frantically into the sterile, beeping hospital room, she found the old man looking impossibly fragile, his silver hair plastered to a pale, heavily sweating forehead surrounded by menacing medical equipment. Arthur's tired eyes fluttered open at the soft sound of her familiar footsteps, a weak, genuine smile gracing his pale lips, as Ivy gently took his trembling, cold hand tightly in hers. He struggled immensely to speak, his breathing incredibly shallow and highly labored, but he stubbornly insisted that she listen carefully to the heavy words he had carried as a massive burden for several decades. He told her weakly about a heavy wooden box hidden carefully beneath the floorboards of his old bedroom, containing massive secrets about her family, that he had spent his entire life trying to slowly piece together. Before he could fully explain the crucial details, the heart monitors began to blare loudly, and a rapid team of nurses rushed into the room, ushering a sobbing Ivy out into the cold, brightly lit hallway. 2 agonizing hours later, a solemn doctor walked out and delivered the devastating news that Arthur had passed away, leaving Ivy mourning the terrible loss of the only father figure she had ever truly known. The funeral was a highly quiet, deeply respectful affair, attended only by a handful of local weathered farmers, the loyal farmhand Samuel and Edward, who stood silently by Ivy's side, offering a steady, comforting presence in the massive storm of her grief. After the somber service concluded, Ivy nervously approached the lawyer handling Arthur's meager, simple estate, a sharp-minded, highly professional attorney named Raymond, who handed her a heavy, ancient wooden box. Raymond explained clearly that Arthur had left explicit, legally binding instructions that the box was to be given exclusively to her, along with the contact information of a highly skilled archivist named Eleanor he had hired years ago. Sitting quietly at the small kitchen table of her cramped trailer later that night, Ivy pried the rusted metal hinges open, revealing a thick stack of yellowed property deeds, old county maps, and deeply faded handwritten letters. As she meticulously unfolded the incredibly brittle, delicate documents, a specific name leaped right off the page, making her heart slam violently against her ribs. Helen Montgomery. Helen was her biological grandmother, a woman whose true history had always been a massive mystery to her mother, Catherine. But the papers in the box painted a highly shocking, entirely different picture of the past. The official deeds clearly indicated that the Montgomery family had once owned thousands of acres of prime, highly valuable grazing land in the Shenandoah Valley, a vast fortune that had completely vanished from the historical record. According to Arthur's extensive handwritten notes and the legal filings he had aggressively scavenged, the incredibly valuable land had been systematically stolen from her grandparents during a highly corrupt legal dispute exactly 50 years ago. The absolutely most devastating revelation lay hidden in the prominent names of the men who had ruthlessly orchestrated the massive theft, utilizing forged signatures and heavily bribed judges to strip the Montgomerys of their legacy. The primary beneficiary of the massively stolen acreage was the Abbott family, and the secondary beneficiary was the Price family, meaning the massive empires of Aaron and Valerie were built directly on the ruins of Ivy's bloodline. Arthur's final, incredibly emotional letter explained that he had grown up with her grandfather, witnessing the total destruction of the Montgomery family firsthand, and had sworn to gather enough hard evidence to one day right the terrible wrong. He had instantly recognized Ivy the very moment she walked onto his farm, spending his final years securing the absolute final pieces of proof needed to expose the town's elite and restore her rightful legacy. Armed entirely with a profound truth that could completely level the valley's entrenched power structure, Ivy contacted Raymond, handing over the box and eagerly asking if the documents held up in a modern court of law. Raymond brought in Eleanor, the highly experienced archivist, and a dedicated team of forensic accountants, verifying completely that the ancient deeds and the hard evidence of judicial corruption were undeniably legally authentic. When Edward drove out to the distant orchard to check on her, Ivy laid the highly explosive documents out on the table, watching the color completely drain from his face, as he realized his family's legacy was rooted in a monumental crime. Instead of blindly defending his father Edward's jaw set in an incredibly hard, determined line, he promised to stand firmly by her, declaring that the truth mattered far more than the blood in his veins or the money in his massive trust fund. The shocking news of the impending massive lawsuit hit the Shenandoah Valley like a terrifying seismic shockwave, sending the incredibly wealthy Abbott and Price families into a frantic, deeply desperate panic. Valerie frantically attempted to launch another malicious smear campaign, but the completely undeniable paper trail and the aggressive involvement of federal investigators quickly, permanently silenced her venomous, fabricated whispers. Aaron spent days locked securely in his study, obsessively reviewing the copies of the old deeds his expensive lawyers provided, slowly realizing that the untouchable empire he so fiercely protected was a stolen castle built on sand. For the very first time in his life, the powerful agricultural baron had to confront the harsh reality that his ancestors were common thieves and that the young woman he had treated like dirt was the rightful heir to the valley. The highly anticipated legal hearing took place in the grand historic municipal courthouse, packed completely to the brim with aggressive reporters, extremely nervous landowners, and citizens eager to witness the massive fall of the valley's elite. Raymond methodically, brilliantly presented the entire contents of Arthur's wooden box, displaying the original deeds, the obviously forged transfer documents, and the irrefutable proof of the historical land theft on a large projector screen. Edward sat firmly, proudly beside Ivy, in the very front row, his hand gripping hers tightly, presenting a highly united front that completely shattered Aaron's desperate hopes of intimidating the young woman into a quiet, secret settlement. Valerie sat quietly in the back, her face incredibly pale, and her social reputation entirely destroyed, as the court detailed exactly how her family had massively profited from the illegal seizure of the Montgomery estate. When the judge finally struck his heavy wooden gavel, ruling completely in favor of the Montgomery estate and ordering the immediate full restitution of the stolen lands, a stunned, profound silence fell over the massive courtroom. The historic decision meant that Ivy was now the highly legal owner of a massive, significant portion of the valley, shifting the balance of power overnight and completely vindicating the immense suffering of her mother and grandparents. As the massive crowd began to slowly disperse, Aaron slowly approached Ivy, removing his expensive hat and bowing his head in a rare gesture of genuine, profound defeat and unexpected humility. He offered a highly sincere apology, not just for the terrible crimes of his ancestors, but for his own immense arrogance and cruelty, admitting that she possessed far more character than anyone in his privileged circle. Ivy did not gloat or aggressively demand further vengeance. She simply accepted his apology with quiet, remarkable grace, stating clearly that her only true desire was to build a future completely free from the dark shadows of the past. In the months that followed, she utilized the massive recovered assets to establish a huge agricultural cooperative, heavily ensuring that struggling farmers would never be driven off their land by corporate greed again. Edward stepped completely away from his father's empire, choosing to work closely alongside Ivy to manage the new cooperative, building a beautiful life defined entirely by hard work and integrity rather than inherited entitlement. Valerie, heavily disgraced and stripped entirely of her high social standing, eventually moved far away from the valley, completely unable to face the community she had tried to deeply manipulate. They held their beautiful, intimate wedding on a grassy ridge overlooking the newly restored Montgomery lands, surrounded entirely by the loyal people who had stood by them through the darkest days, including Martha, the diner owner Samuel the farmhand, and Thomas the foreman. Standing under the vast Virginia sky, Ivy looked out over the rolling hills and grazing herds, feeling a profound, beautiful sense of peace settle permanently over her weary soul. The incredibly long journey from a penniless, heavily grieving daughter to the proud steward of her family's massive legacy had been forged entirely in the hot fires of betrayal and immense loss. Yet as she held Edward's hand, she knew completely that every single tear shed had paved the hard way to this incredibly beautiful redemption. As we journey through the unpredictable and frequently harsh seasons of our complex lives, it is incredibly important to recognize that the heaviest burdens we are unfairly forced to carry often serve to deeply strengthen our ultimate resolve. We will frequently encounter self-serving individuals who attempt to manipulate, deceive, and cruelly dismantle our hard-earned stability simply to satisfy their own hollow ambitions. However, the most genuine and enduring victories are rarely achieved through loud, aggressive vengeance. Rather, they are quietly forged through an unyielding commitment to discovering the profound truth and preserving our moral integrity. When we patiently endure the frightening storms without ever losing our capacity to love and genuinely forgive, we eventually uncover an incredible, resilient strength we never knew we possessed. Ultimately, an authentically rich and deeply meaningful life is absolutely never measured by the financial wealth we accumulate, but by the quiet dignity with which we consistently choose to walk the challenging road toward genuine justice. It is through remaining steadfast in our integrity, even when the world attempts to break us, that we reclaim our profound humanity, leaving behind a legacy of profound healing for the generations that follow.